the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things. Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Today, I am lucky enough to be with Sally Constain. Sally, could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Hi, everyone. I'm a retired school teacher, originally from New York City. I've always been a lover of stories and the written and spoken word. And in retirement, I've had the privilege of being able to write a novel, The Keys to Fanny, which is a historical fiction and coming of age story, an immigrant story, the turn of the last century. I've written quite a bit of poetry and essays, and happy to share with whoever is interested.
Sally, tell me how you first decided to write a novel.
Well, I was retired and I thought I would just take some writing courses and try to write some more essays and poems, some short pieces. And the teacher, whose class I began to enjoy, encouraged all of us to write bigger pieces. And I thought I didn't have it in me, and the teacher encouraged me to start one chapter at a time. And that's how I began to write my novel. I based the beginning of it on stories my grandmother had told me about her childhood in the Ukraine, in a very small town. And I knew that our ancestors had escaped at some time. And I didn't know too much more. But I did know that at that time and place, girls were not sent to school and marriages were arranged. And in my fictionalized version, I have my character, Fanny, wishing to not have an arranged marriage and wishing she could go to school. And so I mixed a lot of what I did know to be true with a lot of things that I made up as I went along.
Well, that's really interesting considering the political atmosphere that we have today with the
Yes.
Ukraine.
When my grandparents lived in the Ukraine, it was under Tsarist Russian rule. And there were a lot of what they call pogroms, were attacks on the little villages by the Cossacks. And life was hard for them, and a lot of our relatives were able to escape. But yes, it was parallel in some ways.
Well, that's just very interesting. And do you plan to write a sequel?
Yes, I'm planning to write a sequel. I have to, put it in some kind of order. First, actually, I have to reread my entire novel and make notes, and then update some things and begin. And I will write it as I wrote the original, chapter by chapter, not really knowing how I was going to end the book. I sort of lived in the skin of my main character and developed some of the other characters as I went along. And as I was writing the book, it was if it was just an interesting adventure. And I plan to do the same with my sequel.
Will it be the same main character?
Yes. And also I will keep quite a few of the characters that I developed. And she had left her papa and her brother, younger brother, in Ukraine when she escaped in my book. And I haven't decided yet whether they're coming to New York or when they would come. And she made some very nice friends in New York, and she managed to go to school. So I have to see what the progress is going to be. And also she has an aunt who she escaped with, who has sort of a story of her own. I want to develop her Aunt Frida's story.
I like that you are talking about creating a sequel. This is so long after it's been written. You need to go back and reread the original. So many people plot out, a 3-book series.
I know.
And they continue that writing. And I like your exercise of actually letting it sit and rest, because the characters will probably change in between the moment that the book ended and that before the next one begins,
Yes.
that you're able to take that opportunity to really let them develop themselves as well.
Yes, many things intervened, since I first wrote it. And when I wrote it, I never thought about a sequel, but so many people who read it, people I knew and people I didn't know who wrote reviews, have encouraged me to write a sequel. They didn't want to leave my characters. They wanted to see what happened with their lives and how they progressed. And as I mentioned, Aunt Frida, I actually, when I wrote my novel, I thought Aunt Frida, I would have her in the beginning of the book and she would help Fanny to a certain extent, and then she would go her way. But she became a very strong character and she didn't want to leave Fanny. But once they got to New York, she sort of got her a lot of gumption, because don't forget, they grew up in a time and place where girls were not given any choices. And she was a widow by the time they came to New York. And now she found some sort of freedom. And so I want to go with that too. And she's a woman, let's say in her 50s or so. And, people sometimes just like to have young characters, as if people on in years don't really have a chance at changes in their lives. So I want to work with her too.
What time frame are we talking about?
We're talking about just the turn of the last century, the very early 1900s in New York. Well, they come to New York City, to the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
What an exciting time for women. If you're creating this strong character and she's discovering herself, she's able to discover a lot more than just who she is, but how she could possibly be involved with the growth of women in America.
Yes. In order to be a strong woman in those days, you had to be very strong, So I have to say, as I told you, Alison, honestly, I enjoyed writing my novel. It wasn't any effort on my part because I just kept living with the characters. I went down to the Lower East Side and I visited the Tenement Museum and I walked the streets where Fanny would walk. I saw the actual school building, that school building was over 100 years old, like many are in New York. And I could see the big padlocks on the door. And I could just feel everything. I knew the little park where we have two scenes in the book where that park is featured. And so it was physical, that I could physically feel as I wrote the book.
Well, that's exciting. I understand you also like to write some poetry.
I love writing poetry. Poetry, for me, as I go along, I'm, developing more and more of the craft. It's a place of comfort for me. And it helps me express my feelings and my thoughts. And I just love playing with the words and using poetic license. And I belong to the Florida State Poets Association. Local chapter is the North Florida Poetry Hub. And we meet on Zoom about 3 times a month. And we had a chance to meet in person for a celebration of my latest chapbook called Autumn Again, which is actually consists just of a handful of poems that were written when I was recuperating from an illness. And it was just a wonderful outlet for me.
Well, poetry is such a wonderful way to describe things that aren't concrete. So that's one of the benefits, right? We can really tap into this the spirituality of poetry. There's a flow to poetry. There's a connection to the universe and to nature and to all these things that aren't concrete, that we have trouble describing when we're just using like normal English. Okay, you can't see me, but I have my air quotes going, normal English. So yeah, I think poetry is such a great outlet, especially if if you're feeling not well, or if something's not right in your world, or if something's extremely right in the world.
It's true. And I love the play of the words. Poems don't have to rhyme. People who don't write poetry, they think if it doesn't rhyme, there's something wrong with it. But a rhyme is fine if you're not forcing it. If you just write, sometimes I have rhyme, sometimes I have internal rhyme within a line, or I use a lot of alliteration because it just comes naturally and it feels good. And it's also something you can almost sculpt. As you write it, you can pare it down, and it's like a sculptor with clay, and form it just the way you want it to sound.
That's a really beautiful way to describe poetry. I like the idea of sculpting it like you would clay. Such a great image.
Thank you.
What are you working on now?
I was working on some haikus, actually, and with the Poetry Hub. And I'm also going to enter some contests that the Florida State Poets Association have their yearly contests. I never really entered anything like that before, but I'm going to try to do that because I want to consider myself, quote unquote, a prize-winning poet. And I'm not a competitive person, but I think it will be fun. So I'm going to polish up a few of my poems and try to edit them to a place where they're ready to be submitted.
Oh, that's wonderful. I had entered a contest at one point just on a whim, and I got a second place.
Wow.
Finish, and I was so excited. I was jumping up and down, holding my piece of paper. I was like, oh my goodness. I realized that, writing and entering contest things is kind of fun.
It is. It's a lot of fun. To me, it is, anyhow. I was so surprised because my younger grandson, he and my older one, they live and breathe basketball. They're teenagers, and he won first place in his high school on the Martin Luther King essay contest and second place in the district. And I didn't picture him. I didn't know he liked to write, although I read to them so much when they were growing up. But I said, did you write that at home? Was it optional? How did that work? He said, no, it was an in-class assignment. We had to do it. So.
Well, whatever it takes to get someone to start putting their pen on a paper.
That's right. Absolutely.
You never know when the connections hit either.
I believe that. I developed my love of story from my grandmother, who was denied an education. But she lived with us, and she would tuck me in every night and tell me stories. A lot of them were the basis for my novel, and she just loved to tell stories. So I think I inherited that or absorbed it from her.
Well, Sally Constain, how can people get in touch with you? How can they find out more?
Okay, so I have a Facebook page, which is Sally Wall Constain Author. Wall is WAHL. If you want to email me, sallywallconstain@gmail.com.
That's so easy. Well, Sally, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. What do you like to do during a rainstorm?
Well, if I tell you I like to read, would that be okay? If the lights are on. If the lights are on, I like to read. If the lights are not on and I have, someone who wants to listen, I will tell stories.
That's amazing. What a great way to entertain yourself during a rainstorm.
Yes.
What do you like to do on a lazy Saturday afternoon? And I'm going to guess before you even answer. Read.
I do like to read. I do like to write. Actually, some Saturday afternoons we have our Zoom call with the Poets Association. So that's one thing. I like to walk. Sometimes my husband and I will take a ride or visit with our family and talk with friends.
Last question. Do you like the movies?
Not so much. I'm not a movie buff, really. There have been certain movies in my life that I've really enjoyed and I could watch them over and over again. And so if I like them, I really like them, but I'd really rather read. You know, I had a wonderful English teacher in high school who told us that she would let her children, as they were growing up, read anything, but she wouldn't let them watch every movie, but she would let them read any book.
Good advice. That's good advice.
I remember it to this day.
Well, Sally Constain, thank you so much for stopping by.
Alison, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for interviewing me, and I'm happy to know you.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Alison out. Woo, we're all done. Sally Constain is a lifelong lover of stories. She was an elementary school teacher and a librarian in New York City for more than 30 years. Sally was president of the writers group at Del Webb, Ponte Vedra for 3 years. Sally is the author of the debut novel, The Keys to Fanny, a work of historical fiction. She has published poetry chapbooks on our common human experience. For more information about Sally, visit her at Sally Constain Author on Facebook. For more information about the Florida Writers Association and about our upcoming Florida Writers Con 2022 and our Florida Writers Youth Summit, registration is now open. Visit floridawriters.org. Until next time.